How's it going, YouTube? Welcome to my research project for the history of humor. I'm a Gen Z person, going to be talking about Gen Z humor, so this is going to be awful. Anyway, as I've been taking this class on the history of humor, I've become more and more interested in Gen Z humor in general and its relation to other generational humor, and I was really curious if there was a way to kind of track this over time, track the changing of humor from generation to generation. I also noticed that what we find funny as children really tends to impact our sense of humor as we age. So I decided to evaluate the humor in children's cartoons from the 1930s to the 2010s. My general thesis for this project is that baby boomers are more attuned to physical and pain-based humor usually depicted in early cartoons, and Gen Z is more attuned to verbal, kind of wit, joke, and banter-based humor of more modern cartoons. Although I do believe that physical humor is fairly timeless and any generation can enjoy Looney Tunes, when it comes to Gen Z and Gen Alpha, I believe that the verbal humor included in the cartoons that they watched opened a pathway for this kind of new absurdity in humor to arise. The absurdity that I'm referencing comes from the development of online meme culture and the quotability of a piece of media. A piece of media can be quoted either visually, audibly, or in the form of an actual quote, like a joke or a one-liner. But it is going to perform much better if that piece of media has more quotability to it. It has a way of removing its context and putting it in a new one. That show is going to perform better because there are going to be more memes made about it. And I believe that this kind of shift is also due to children's cartoons that Gen Z and Gen Alpha watched growing up. I'm going to narrow this down to animated cartoons that a child probably would have watched between the ages of 6 to 12. And only TV shows, because including feature-length films would, although there are some fantastic examples to support this thesis, it would just open up the research much too wide and I would be here for hours talking about it. So we're not going to do that, and we're going to keep it to just animated TV shows for children aged 6 to 12. Now, with those parameters set, let's explore a chronological evolution of children's cartoons. I have focused on shows that either were or still are extremely popular and influential. This does mean I had to cut out some fantastic classics that I would have loved to include. I even did a little survey at work, and I had a list that was over a page long of favorite cartoons around the office. And I really wanted to focus on cartoons that had humor as their main purpose. I know people said stuff like Transformers, but Transformers from the 80s or like Thundercats were not necessarily focused on humor and had humor as kind of like a side thing, but something like Looney Tunes was absolutely focused on humor as its main point. So that kind of helped gauge my decision making for which options I was going to show in this video. This did give me some trouble when it came to between the 60s and the 80s, mainly because they were still producing and watching shows that were made and premiered in the 40s and the 50s, and because a lot of the cartoons from that era, from the 60s to the 80s, were extremely narrative based and didn't necessarily have humor as a primary focus. This did mean that I had to explain to my mother numerous times that Muppet Babies was indeed a puppet show and not a cartoon, but I digress. So let's get into some analysis of some cartoons over time. Starting with the late 1920s and 1930s, first off, we have the iconic Steamboat Willie, produced by Walt Disney and premiered in 1928. You can see in this clip here, there are extremely exaggerated forms, lots of bending of the rules of physics and bodies. Realism doesn't necessarily matter. It's a fantastical world made for children. And you can see here, there is a lot of physical pain as humor. There is extremely repetitive animation, sound effects, but there is no dialogue here as well. The music matches the animation, and we have an extremely simple story told just through visual cues. At this moment here, we have the captain kind of spitting something out, and it hits the bell, which causes him to laugh because he didn't expect that. So for him, that moment there is incongruity humor. But when he goes to do it again, he spits out the little, whatever it is, oil, whatever he's spitting out, and it hits him back in the face. And at that moment, we experience superiority. So there's definitely a lean towards physical pain as humor and superiority theory informing a child's sense of humor. We also have the iconic Betty Boop, which premiered in 1933 and was directed by Dave Fleischer and was produced by Ronald Crandall. We have Mae Questel voicing Betty Boop, and we also have Cab Calloway voicing Coco the Clown, where he sings his infamous St. Jane's Infirmary Blues. This is also based on the Brothers Grimm fairy tale of Snow White. And here we have dialogue, but it is singing as dialogue. There's also extremely repetitive animation, and by that, it's kind of one cell of animation done over and over again to kind of take up time. And we also still have the same exaggerated forms, very bendy limbs, breaking of physics that we had in Steamboat Willie, and no real sense of realism. Moving on to what some would call as the golden era of cartoons, we have the 1940s and the 1950s. So to start off, I wanted to talk about Tom and Jerry. Now this was created by William Hanna and Joseph Barbara, and it was produced by MGM Studios and premiered in 1940. We can see the use of realistic settings. It's no longer a fairy forest or a mouse driving a steamboat. It is an industrial setting for this example. But in terms of actions and consequences, realism is gone. You know, using the cat fur as a parachute, there's an extreme bending of physics, no real sense of realism. And there's also this kind of really great exaggerated physical expression, exaggerated injuries, and again, no dialogue. There's also a flat, unmoving background with all of the focus clearly on the two main characters, who are also the only characters in this scene. Now moving on to probably the most iconic on this list, and the one that I was probably most excited and most nervous to talk about, is the Looney Tunes. This is an absolutely timeless classic produced by Warner Brothers and premiered in 1940. It has a long-standing legacy and is even still being produced today in a similar style. If we break down and analyze the kind of style of these Looney Tunes cartoons, we can see that the animation is extremely supplemented by music, almost to the point where they are one and the same. You can't have the music without the animation, and you can't have the animation without the music. They are the same kind of entity, and they work extremely well together to create the comedic timing and tension and adding to the narrative of the show, even with very little dialogue. The physics are absolutely taken to the extreme in these kinds of cartoons. There is so much physical pain. It's the main focus of the humor in the show. Almost all of the storylines are in these shorts that center around the two, usually maybe three main characters causing physical harm to each other. And the injuries are extremely exaggerated. I'm sure we can all imagine the kind of goose egg bump riding out of Roadrunner's head with the little Tweety birds running around it, or even again, you know, the kind of the stripping of the skin like we saw in Tom and Jerry, or with this one, how he hits the anvil and then he turns into almost a liquid and slides off. So extremely exaggerated pain, extremely exaggerated injuries, and mainly used as a sense of humor. They kind of almost go back to the Roman comedy caricatures of, you know, a dumb master and the witty slave that, you know, outsmarts him. They kind of always have that kind of dynamic of the two main characters one is trying to outsmart the other, and the other one is using brute strength and often hurts themselves more than they hurt the other person. Now moving on to the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Again, I had to group all of those together because there were not a lot of cartoons that premiered in this time period that had comedy as their main focus and that weren't, again, the Muppet Babies, which my mother still insists should be on this list, but anyways, back to it. For this era, I wanted to start off with The Flintstones, which was produced by ABC and was created by William Hanna and Joseph Barbara, which, if you remember, were the same creators as Tom and Jerry. And this premiered in 1960. So for this, we kind of start to see a change. We have human characters, and there is a ton of dialogue. There are clear, complex stories and scenarios that are set up to kind of supplement the humor. And even he has that comment of calling Barney Pagliacci, which is a reference to the opera, and Pagliacci also means clown, and is kind of a cultural joke aimed at Barney. So we can see that kind of more verbal humor also pulling on cultural references. And we can even see Fred as a satirization as kind of the typical American father, even though it's set in the Stone Ages. And much of the basis of the humor of this show comes from the modernization of antiquity and how would the Stone Age do bowling or vending machines. That's what this show uses as its sense of humor. So we kind of start to see a little more like intellectual kind of thinking a little bit more about what's going on in the show in order to really get the joke. You can also notice here in this clip, you might have to, watch it a couple times, but the music really fades into the background. It's there, but it's nowhere near as important as it was, say, in the Looney Tunes or Tom and Jerry, where it was very much at the forefront of what you were paying attention to. We also have the introduction of a laugh track for this one as well, kind of pulling almost more like it's a sitcom rather than an animated cartoon. We also have very clear examples of verbal humor with the joke or pun, "Nothing can cool me off." There are still elements of physical pain for humor in the show, with Barney at the end being chucked down the bowling alley, but we do see clear steps towards conversational humor and jokes. And I think the thing that stands out the most to me with this show is it seems like the first step towards family cartoons, shows that are made for the whole family that happen to be animated, hence those cultural jokes, the satirization of adult characters or archetypes, the American dad, the bumbling friend, the women who really know what's going on, and the men making a mess of everything, the laugh tracks. All of that kind of suggests a step towards more mature humor, but it is still safe for all audiences. There isn't anything lewd or inappropriate about the humor going on, so it kind of reads more as like a family sitcom. Next up, we have the classic Scooby-Doo, which was premiered in 1969 and produced by Warner Brothers. This show here is definitely more story-based, with a clear emphasis on dialogue over physical humor. With the exception of clips like this, I actually kind of had to look for comedic clips. And the physical violence you can see is really toned down compared to something like Looney Tunes. And the gag is usually played on the bad guys rather than on each other. So with things like Looney Tunes, you had the two main characters and they were causing each other pain, where in something like this, Shaggy and Scooby are working together in order to cause physical pain to the bad guys. So kind of having morals step in the way. It's not a fight your sibling moment, it's a fight the bad guy kind of moment. Another kind of key thing with this show is that the humor is almost exclusively saved for Shaggy and Scooby. So these comedic characters kind of work to keep us entertained. If you're too young and not fully understanding the dialogue or the narrative, you always have Scooby and Shaggy to laugh at. It kind of helps it be acceptable for all ages. The show can also be a little spooky or a little scary for some younger kids. So it kind of helps to even out the tension a little bit, and actually works to help with something like Relief Theory, where you have all of this nervous energy and this tension being built up. by the spookiness and the scariness of the show, and then having that kind of release happen with Scooby and Shaggy coming in and being their wonderful goofy selves. So we have those other kind of comedy theories coming in and working to help the show gain popularity. One of the most iconic things about this show, at least to me, is the sound effects. I think they are absolutely brilliant, and they add so much to the kind of absurdity of the animation as well, with those slurs when Shaggy and Scooby are running, and having that kind of percussive sound effect whenever they go to run away. It's awesome, and you can hear that noise and you know exactly which cartoon it is. So that is absolutely the sound effect team doing something extremely well to help make the show very, very popular and kind of solidify it in the evolution of cartoons. So taking another step forward into extremely pivotal time for animation, we have the 90s. And the first thing to really come out of the 90s that really stands out to me is, of course, The Simpsons. This was created by Matt Groening and was produced by Fox Broadcasting Company and premiered in 1989, so right on the cusp of the 90s.
Right, who broke my vase?
Who took all my test papers off the refrigerator and tore them up?
Who spread garbage all over Flanders Yard before I got a chance to?
Oh, please. This is senseless destruction with none of my usual social commentary.
If it wasn't you, then who was it?
Well, I'm sure these things didn't destroy themselves, now did they?
Did they? I guess Bart's not to blame. He's lucky, too, because it's spanking season and I got a hankering for some spankerin'.
Again, this kind of aims itself as another family-style cartoon, something for the whole family to enjoy. I really enjoy this clip because Bart is usually the one causing the destruction, you know, having the archetype as the destructive young boy, kind of the rebel of the family. And he's aware of this fully, but the family pins all of these unfortunate recent events on him while clearly ignoring the destructive dog, obviously being the culprit for all of these things. As he says, it doesn't have his usual kind of social commentary with it. So he's a rebel, he causes destruction, but he knows why he does it, and he's doing it to gain attention and to say something. And I think it's a beautiful depiction of kind of family dynamics in a typical nuclear American household. Especially with this clip, the dialogue and the animation really go hand in hand to create the joke. Without either element, the joke really wouldn't land. It creates a quotability to the show. Most people can probably think of something from the show, even if they don't know that it's necessarily from The Simpsons. You know, a few years ago, it was the Spider Pig thing. There's constantly been predictions. The Simpsons is constantly kind of in the media. It's always a reaction image on Twitter. The quotability of the show, the dialogue, as well as the kind of absurd animation really go hand in hand to create something that's extremely popular and that's something that people reference constantly. Most of the show is dialogue or situational humor, kind of like a sitcom. There is a level of absurdity with the dog running around with a knife in its mouth, but there's no real bending of physics like we saw in earlier cartoons. Another really important kind of step forward is there is no music in this clip, so they really want you to pay attention to the dialogue. They don't want anything distracting you from the joke or from what is actually happening. The focus is on the dialogue as well as the animation to get the point across. Next up, we have what I like to refer to as The Simpsons' younger cousin, being SpongeBob SquarePants. This show was created by Steven Hillenburg, who was a marine biologist and an animator, and he went on to kind of create this show with the inspiration of marine biology in his background, and it was picked up and produced by Nickelodeon and premiered in 1999. Now, this is when the absurdity, specifically in children's cartoons, really ramps up. They're no longer kind of mammals like cats or dogs, or they're no longer like humanoid creatures. Like even in The Simpsons, you can clearly tell that they're supposed to be humans. They're just extremely stylized. But this one, SpongeBob is a sponge, Squidward's a squid, Patrick's a starfish. Not things we've really seen in children's cartoon yet. It really kind of ramps up the absurdity of who the main characters in children's cartoons can really be.
It doesn't make any sense. The Krabby Patty is an absolute good. Nobody is immune to its tasty charms.
Nobody but me.
Are you sure?
Does this look unsure to you?
No.
Good. Now go spread the word.
Something that I really love about SpongeBob, something that's always made me laugh because I grew up watching this show, is that it frequently cuts to these hyper-realistic images to be humorous, and it adds this level of like quotable images to the mix. There are many like YouTube videos or blog posts kind of compiling all of the moments from SpongeBob that have been used for meme culture, like reaction images on Twitter usually, or even audios on TikToks. Like there are hundreds, if not thousands of them. I think there is actually a meme moment from SpongeBob for every single episode that has aired. The kind of quotability or memeability of SpongeBob wasn't something that was necessarily intentional by Steven Hillenburg. It was just the fantastic animation, direction, and writing of the show that led to it being this iconic thing, as well as a lot of the people that are using the internet now and creating these memes. We all grew up on SpongeBob, so it's all something that is in our common vocabulary that we can use to connect with other people and use that iconography of SpongeBob to, you know, help further our points or kind of improve the comedy that we are trying to accomplish in a meme. Again, similar to The Simpsons, there is no music in this clip. Only at the very end is it used for transition or embellishments. They really do want you to listen to the dialogue, again, for that kind of quotability of the show. It helps inform the narrative if you are paying attention to what the characters are saying rather than strictly focusing on the physical actions that they are performing. Now, last but certainly not least, we have the cartoon that absolutely spun me on my head, and that is The Amazing World of Gumball. This show was created by Ben Boccolet and was produced by Cartoon Network and premiered back in 2011 and is still airing to this day. Literally, I don't know what is happening in this show. This is my rough analysis of it, but this show is absolutely overstimulation. It's a piece of art, really, is what it is. It absolutely satirizes everything. There is nothing that this show will not satirize and make fun of. In this clip, it happens to be a satirization of action movies, and it just does it does it so well. There is the drama, there is the action to it, there is the kind of high stakes. It's beautiful. And it really, to me, the thing that absolutely stands out to me about this show, and it kind of started with SpongeBob, but this show absolutely takes it and goes all the way with it, is embracing children's imagination. To me, this show, unlike the other ones that we've seen before, the previous shows, it seems like an adult creating entertainment for children, whereas The Amazing World of Gumball here, it feels like looking at the world through children's eyes. Like to me, it feels like what being 11 years old was. Of course, you know, I didn't see the world exactly like how they're depicting it, but it felt the same. This imagination and this creativity, it really feels like an embracing of imagination. And I really, really enjoy that about this show. And I think it definitely adds a je ne sais quoi to the show. Absolutely every level of this show is absurd. From the character models to the scenarios and the situations that they end up in, as well as the humor. It can definitely be an assault on the senses and extremely overstimulating, but I feel like it uses it perfectly to its advantage. It uses so many different kinds of animation. It's kind of like a fruit salad of animation, and each character has a unique character design and a unique sense of animation, and it really helps to highlight and to fully flesh out each character's personalities. And it also helps you remember each character and their storylines. Again, the funniest one that stands out to me in this clip here is that the cop is a donut and is 3D rendered rather than 2D rendered. It's beautiful. The cop being a donut and getting his face eaten. I mean, it's terrifying, but it's also hilarious. I also love that this show utilizes different points of view and is not just kind of like an onlooker looking at the scene happening. It actually puts you kind of in that first person perspective of being one of the characters, which I think is very interesting, and it plays around with the form of animated cartoons. Again, this is like a prime example of overstimulation to create tension. When he pauses to pick the pickle, everything slows. It has been this high, fast-paced, overstimulating moment, and then everything stops. He picks out the pickle, everything becomes quieter, and then it immediately resumes to extreme overstimulation. And it absolutely leans into that incongruity and that relief, building up that tension, and then also something that you're not expecting happening. He was literally consuming everything in sight, but stopped to pick the pickle out of the burger. Again, the absurdity is fantastic. The show does use physical violence and almost body horror to portray its humor, but to me, the fact that we laugh at that is almost what makes it absurd and makes it funny. The fact that we are laughing at something so kind of horrific and weird. Again, doing a little bit of formal analysis, there is no background music in these clips. It's only really used for ornamentation or sound effects. Like, it's used in the satirization of the action movie because it's this emotional, sweeping music that is used to build intensity. But for most of the other clips of just everyday dialogue, there is no background music. So it's mainly used as ornamentation.
Hey, do you mind if I put a poster in your window? It's for my mom. She's missing.
Oh, gosh. Go ahead.
The humor in this clip here, this has to be my favorite clip from the show. Like, I saw this before I even researched it. I saw this a couple years ago, I think just after it aired on TikTok, and it still makes me laugh uncontrollably. And the humor in this clip is extremely dry, and it fits perfectly kind of with incongruity but also relief theory, because you have this buildup of emotion for this banana kid who has lost his mom and he's looking for her, only to have that tension and emotion released when he puts a nail through the window. And it makes me giggle. It's beautiful. The different types of animation, the voice acting in the show, it's perfect. It's brilliant. And I cannot wait to see what Gen Alpha does with this kind of influence and how insane their sense of humor is going to be after consuming shows like this. It's going to be insane, and we're not going to be able to keep up with it, but I am a little excited. In conclusion, I think after all of this analysis, it's clear that cartoons have definitely changed in many ways, subtly over time, but quite drastically when you compare the bookends of what we looked at. Overall, there's always going to be physical humor in this type of media, but in the last few decades, I think we've seen a rise in dialogue-based humor as a means to enhance the humor by providing context and jokes. I also believe that these developments, especially with SpongeBob and now Gumball, we have seen the rise of absurdity in humor. An absurdity that no longer rises from the bending of physics, but the embracing of children's imagination and the increased pressure for media to be quotable. We also kind of see the addition of shows like The Flintstones and The Simpsons that were geared towards a family audience rather than strictly children, and they would kind of gesture towards more adult jokes, but because this is done through dialogue, kids didn't always catch on. You know, I'm sure we've all seen TV shows or movies where there is a joke that kind of goes right over kids' heads, but as an adult, you can appreciate the fact that they put it in to kind of make it less painful for the adult to watch. Kind of a bit of a side tangent and something that I didn't necessarily get the chance to talk to, but I think would absolutely be something that would be cool to talk about, is this kind of stem off of children's cartoons, or a stem off of cartoons made for families, which was cartoons aimed strictly at adults and more mature audiences. Adult cartoons are extremely new and they only really started in the 90s. They definitely rely heavily on verbal humor in order to appeal to a more mature audience. Think of things like South Park, Rick and Morty, Futurama, Smiling Friends. All of these things, although they do incorporate physical humor or pain-based humor, the main focus is verbal humor to appeal to that more mature audience. So with this kind of evolution of humor that we've looked at, I think it's really clear to see how we've gone from more physical-based humor to more verbal-based humor. There's always going to be an aspects of both in within cartoons, I think, because of the timelessness of physical humor. I feel like humans have always found that funny. And we can definitely see that physical humor has maintained a strong hold on animation throughout its lifetime. But I definitely think that with the introduction of verbal humor and what we've looked at today, it's definitely allowed kind of younger generations, like people like Gen Z, Gen Alpha, to embrace this kind of wit and joke-based humor from a very early age, and also introduced us to kind of absurd humor at an early age as well, making us more attuned to it than, say, the baby boomer generation who grew up kind of strictly on physical pain-based humor in their children's cartoons. So in conclusion, I really hope that you enjoyed this retrospective of animated cartoons and their impact on humor. I hope this gave you a new perspective on how we consume this type of media, and I hope it ruined all future viewing experiences of cartoons by forcing you to analyze every aspect of animation, dialogue, music, sound effects, and overall absurdity in regards to humor. Thanks for watching.